With that, the people of the state of Michigan call Catherine Meredith to the stand.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please have a seat. State your name for the record.
Catherine Meredith.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you please indicate to the jury what department you work for, please?
I work for the Michigan State Police in the Forensic Science Division.
And how long have you been in the Forensic Science Division?
Almost 13 years.
Now, to be assigned to the Forensic Science Division, I would imagine it requires some education and some training. So let's talk about your education. How are you educated?
I have a bachelor's degree in biology from Grand Valley State University and a master's degree in forensic science from the University of New Haven.
And it's 13 years, right? Just so I have it in my head that you're...
In February, it'll be 13 years.
What sort of training program does the state police put you through prior to you being able to kind of work on your own?
The training program is internal for 2 different steps of our process. I trained for approximately 6 months in body fluid identification and approximately a year for DNA analysis, in addition to ongoing training that's required annually to stay proficient and up to date in our technologies. That training would involve everything from working under senior analysts to reviewing scientific journals and policies and procedures within the laboratory, working with mock casework samples, and then passing a competency test at the completion of the training program.
And I am assuming that you have done all that and passed the test.
I have.
Now, how many times, if you could, on average, how many cases are you working on a monthly or bi-monthly basis?
I would estimate an average number of cases per month would be anywhere from 10 to 25 on average, depending on the type of cases being worked.
And I'm assuming also that that kind of runs the gamut, if you will, from, in this particular case, homicides all the way down to other particular crimes, whatever agencies are looking for potential DNA on.
That's correct. It's any variety of types of crimes and any variety of types of sample that could be associated to that criminal event.
Now, have you testified in court as an expert before?
I have 53 times prior and 3 times in this courtroom.
Okay. So, and I'm, again, going to assume that of all those times you were qualified as an expert and accepted by the court as an expert in this particular area?
That's correct.
Any times that you weren't?
No.
Your Honor, I would move to qualify Ms. Meredith as an expert in forensic biology that would include serology, DNA analysis, and the statistical significance of DNA profiles.
No objection. You may examine her as an expert in the areas outlined in your comment.
Thank you. All right, let's start basic and get down to what you did in this particular investigation. First of all, could you explain to the jury what forensic biology is, please?
Sure. Forensic biology would be the application of basic biological principles to criminal investigations. Our biology process is twofold. First, we have serology, or body fluid identification, where we're analyzing evidence related to criminal matters for the presence of biological material. If biological material is found, it is isolated, and that second step of the process would be the DNA testing of that biological material.
All right. And what, again, in a general sense, what is DNA and where can we find it?
DNA is the basic genetic material of a living individual. That material is inherited half from mother and half from father, and that combination from mom and dad is what gives a person their unique DNA profile, with the exception of identical twins. DNA can be found in blood, semen, seminal fluid, saliva, hair roots, tissue, cellular material, as different body fluids we can find DNA in.
Now, what types of, or I guess could you explain the DNA profiling procedures that the Michigan State Police Crime Lab uses?
Yes, we use a process called PCR-STR. That process is a multi-step process where we take a sample that is suitable for DNA testing. It's in about a 2-inch tube. That sample is added, a series of chemicals and reagents are added first to break open the cells in extraction. The next step of that process would be to quantify the amount of DNA. Following that, we would add another series of chemicals and reagents, and we would copy the DNA millions of times. Whatever was in that sample would be copied. That copied DNA would then be put on a genetic analyzer that operates with an electrical current. That analyzer feeds data into a software program, and that software program is what we're able to use to develop DNA profiles, so to speak, that are a picture of a DNA profile from a sample or from a specific individual or a reference sample.
Okay. What, and from that, what types of interpretations can you make?
So I mentioned that we would process evidence samples, or we would process reference samples, or samples from known to be taken from a specific person. We can look at the DNA from the evidence sample, and we can determine the number of contributors to that sample, and we can compare the evidence sample to known DNA samples from individuals to determine if there are common types, if there's which would be a match or an inclusion. We can also look at those types and determine that they are not common, which would be an exclusion. Or we may have an evidentiary sample that is just too complicated or is inconclusive and we can't make determinations from.
So essentially there are three determinations. Inclusion, as you indicated, means that the profiles match from your known sample to your test sample.
We see common DNA types.
Then you've got the exclusion, where there are no common DNA types.
Correct.
And then there's the I guess the more complicated or convoluted sample, which doesn't allow you to separate the two, and it's inconclusive.
Correct.
Okay. Can you describe a little bit about the effect that, or how fragile, I like to classify how fragile DNA is based on its environment?
Sure. As I mentioned, DNA is unique to an individual, and that DNA doesn't change within a person. However, environmental factors can have an influence on the quality of DNA that we have to work with. Those environmental factors would include sunlight, UV radiation, moisture, excessive heat, dirt and bacteria. All of those environmental conditions or factors can have an influence over the quality of DNA we're able to obtain when we go through that profiling process that I described previously.
Now, along those lines, we hear of cases that are sometimes 20, 25 years old, and experts like yourself going back and processing samples and finding DNA. Is it possible for DNA or substances to last that long?
It is. We work cold cases on a fairly regular basis that are samples that are older. It's really dependent on those environmental conditions and how a sample was preserved or stored, how good the quality of that DNA profile is when we do the lab work on it.
So it's not unusual to find DNA profiles years later?
It's not.
On samples?
No.
Okay. Now, let's talk about what measures you take to ensure that your results are reliable. What controls are in the lab to help ensure that your results are reliable?
So we're always trying to work with a sterile environment, so we're wearing face masks, gloves, laboratory coats. Those are changed and switched frequently during the process. We're working with bleached bench tops and sterile conditions in the laboratory. We separate those known reference samples from any evidentiary samples. They're processed under a different time and space, so they are not in the same environment. We run controls through the entire process, from the start of the extraction process through the end where we're developing profiles. And those controls are designed to monitor that A, the process is working correctly, and B, that we're not introducing unrelated DNA to the system. Additionally, we go through a 2-step review process for all of our work. All of our reports before being released to an agency are technically reviewed by another trained DNA scientist and administratively reviewed by another analyst to ensure correct reporting. All of these are different steps that we take to ensure the reliability of our work throughout the process.
So essentially, you're protecting against any potential cross-contamination.
Correct.
And I picked up on one thing. So prior to you starting a new case, do you bleach the area that you're working?
Yes, everything between batches of DNA, everything would be cleaned. New equipment would be used. It would be clean tools. We use as much disposable products within the laboratory as possible so that it is a one-time use on equipment. So yes, all of those tasks are done to minimize the chances of cross-contaminating evidentiary samples with each other.
So if I understand you right, bleach is a product, household product, that essentially kills DNA? Or wipes it away, eliminates it?
Bleach is many cleaning products rid DNA, break down that DNA, much like those environmental factors. Cleaning products can break down DNA as well.
All right. Let's talk about the work you did. And this is, I've been labeling it the history of work the lab did prior to the discovery and arrest of the defendant, Jeffrey Willis. The first lab that I'm going to have you look at is, I believe, your record number 4 under GR 14-3508.
Okay.
I'm going to hand you what's marked as People's Exhibit 220. Had you take a look at that. Is that the record that I just referenced?
Yes, it is.
And is that a record you produced?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And I'm not going to do this for everyone, but if you could explain, because the jury's looking at it overhead here, so if you could explain kind of the headers and what all that means, we'll do that one time so they understand.
Okay. So this is a laboratory report for DNA interpretations. The standard formatting of the report has several different headers. That first header just tells the type of crime that we're working with. The next headers could list the names of individuals associated to the incident. So it could be elimination samples, it could be suspect reference samples, it could be victim names involved in the crime. The next section is is titled Evidence. That section references the evidence that is involved in this particular case record. So what interpretations will be made from that section. On the second page, we have a header titled Results of Examination. This section tells the type of chemistry that I used in the DNA laboratory to develop the samples used for interpretation. The following section is headed Conclusions. This is the interpretations of the DNA profiles from that evidence section and what those conclusions were. At the end, there's a section for additional remarks. The disposition of evidence indicates what was done with it when I was at completion. And the last relevant supporting data just indicates data that was used for the reporting purposes.
All right, let's go back to page 1. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
In this particular report, let's talk about the evidence that you had to work with. What were you given?
So I had those small tubes where DNA samples were isolated, or samples for DNA were isolated. I had a sample identified to me as swab from sunglasses. Another sample identified as swab from phone holder. Another sample identified as left wrist swabs. A sample identified as swab from right fingernail clippings and clippers. A swab identified as from left fingernail clippings and clippers. a swab from fired cartridge or fired casings, and blood from Rebecca Bletch.
All right. So essentially, if I understand that last item, were you able to create a known sample from the victim, in this case, Rebecca Bletch?
That would be correct. That last sample would be a reference sample from Rebecca Bletch.
Okay. Now, with that, we'll go to page 2 here, and I know you kind of described already in general the process. What did you do with all of the samples that you were given?
So the samples that I received, those evidentiary samples, were processed together as evidence samples using that lab procedure that I described, where I extracted the samples, I quantified them, I copied them and put them on a genetic analyzer to develop profiles. Those profiles were interpreted and compared back to the DNA profile from Rebecca Bletch. Her sample would have went through that same process in a separate set of samples to develop that known reference sample. And that reference sample then would have been compared to any of the evidence samples obtained.
So for this particular examination, the only known sample you had was that of Rebecca Bletch. You didn't have any others to compare to.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's just go through your conclusions. On the sunglasses, what were you able to determine?
The DNA types from the swab from the sunglasses indicated that at least 2 donors were associated with the sample. The DNA types associated with the major donor were from an unidentified male, and the limited results detected from the minor donor were insufficient for conclusive association, so I could not make any comparison to those types. And Rebecca Bletch was excluded as being a donor to the DNA obtained from the sunglasses.
Now, let me ask you this question, because we've had some testimony in this case that those sunglasses belong to her. Is it surprising or unusual that we might not find her DNA on those sunglasses?
It's really just the conditions, who handled them last, if we were able to detect her DNA or not. When we quantify DNA and see one in a much higher proportion than another, sometimes that results in additional donors being masked. So it varies from sample to sample and how that sample is handled in environmental conditions.
Things that you've already kind of talked about.
Correct.
Okay. The next thing that you analyzed was the foam holder, or the swab from the foam holder. Let me just bring those up here. What were you able to conclude about that?
The DNA types obtained from the swab from the foam holder indicated that at least 3 donors were associated with the sample. Due to the mixture of DNA types that were obtained, that sample was only suitable and used for exclusionary purposes. And I could not make a determination as to whether Rebecca Bletch was a potential donor to that sample or not.
Okay. The next is the left wrist swabs. What were you able to determine about that?
The DNA types obtained from the left wrist swabs indicated that at least 2 donors were associated with the sample. The major DNA types obtained from the left wrist swabs matched Rebecca Bletch, and the limited DNA results obtained from minor donor was insufficient for comparison purposes.
Now, maybe you could describe for the jury, because you said that a couple of times, what does that mean in your world, laboratory?
So it means that when I interpret that evidence sample, I can see that there's more than one person contributing to the sample. But not that second donor isn't contributing in a high enough amount that I can confidently make interpretations. So basically, when I see a mixture where I'm interpreting that there's a major donor and making comparisons to that part of the profile is seen enough that I can confidently make comparisons to it. I can still tell there's a second person, or in one of the previous samples, a third person contributing, but I may or may not be able to compare those persons' types depending on how much of that profile I see or I don't see.
So it's an integrity thing, essentially, right? In essence, you want to have enough of a sample so that you're confident in the conclusion that you are making.
Correct. We want to make sure we're seeing enough of the picture of what's there to make an accurate comparison.
Okay. The next thing that you compared was the swab from the right fingernail clippings and clippings and clippers. What were you able to determine on that?
So the DNA profile from the right fingernail clipping and clippers matched the DNA profile from Rebecca Blatch.
Okay. And swab from the fired shell or cartridge cases. What were you able to determine on that, if anything?
The no DNA typing results were obtained from the swab of the fired casings, so no comparisons were made to that sample.
All right, so you were unable to find any DNA on those.
Correct.
Okay. And then in the remarks, explain, because you mentioned in the remarks there the CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System. What is that?
CODIS is a database maintained by the FBI where evidentiary samples can be uploaded to that database, where we are searched. It is searched on a weekly basis and compared to another database of known reference samples. It's a tool that is used to help identify where unknown samples may have came from. And in this case, those major DNA types from the swab of the sunglasses were an unidentified male donor, and that profile was put into the CODIS database.
And essentially you said FBI, so that's a national database.
It is a national database. It is a multi-tiered database. So locally, so at the Grand Rapids Laboratory, we would be considered a local facility. Locally, we would put evidence samples in from that location. We maintain a state database for the whole state of Michigan. And then the FBI maintains a database where all of those state databases upload into their national database. So it's there are millions of profiles that are in that database to be searched against those reference samples.
So as a hypothetical, you upload a profile into the CODIS system, and it could potentially hit anywhere in the United States.
That's correct.
And that just helps investigators maybe investigating cases around that.
That's correct. It helps relate an evidence sample to an individual. It can also help relate cases to other unsolved cases or solved cases. So we can see matches or hits from evidence to known individuals or from case to case.
That report, People's Exhibit 220, that's a report you authored?
Yes.
Anything different than in that exhibit than the one that you submitted to the agency after you had completed that report?
No.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's Exhibit 220.
To be received.
And just for a date reference, you completed this examination on what date?
This report has a date completed of July 29th, 2014.
All right, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 221. It's, I believe, record number 7. Is this a report that you authored?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, in the evidence portion, explain to the jury what you've got going on here.
So you'll see similar formatting as to the previous report that was displayed. We have that same nature of offense. At the top, you'd note there's the same laboratory number to show that these are related, that they're the same case we're working under. In that evidence section, you see several items, item 1, item 2, item 4AX, 4BX, 4CX, and 4D1X. Those were the evidence samples that were previously described in that record 4 that I just described to you. So they're samples that were already processed for DNA. I had already developed a profile to make comparisons to. In this particular record number, following those samples previously analyzed, there are 4 additional samples. 1 identified as a right wrist swab, and then 3 reference samples, Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar, that were submitted as references to make comparisons back to that evidence.
And I know we've got one more report to go through with you, but through this investigation, were investigators providing you known samples that, for example, in this case, Mr. Metcalf, Mr. Bletch, and Deputy Kanar, for you to use to analyze, go back through and analyze the stuff that, or at least develop profiles and then go back through and see if their profiles are on the evidence you would analyze?
Yes, we analyzed a number of different reference samples. Those reference samples are we commonly process reference samples for elimination purposes to determine if they were contributing to the DNA types on the evidence samples.
All right, so let's go through, and I'm assuming you used the same process as you've already described?
That's correct.
Okay, let's look at your conclusions. The first item, describe that, please.
The first conclusion is referencing the right wrist swabs. No DNA foreign to Rebecca Bletch was observed on the right wrist swabs. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the right wrist swabs.
When you say, just to kind of explain, when you say foreign, does that mean that you didn't find any other profile except for Ms. Bletch's on that swab?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. What else did you conclude?
The additional conclusions are referencing the previously analyzed evidence from record number 4. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the swab from the sunglasses. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the DNA from the swab of the phone holder. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the left wrist swabs. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the swab from the right fingernail clippings and clippers. Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar are excluded as being donors to the swab from the left fingernail clippers and clippings.
Okay. So essentially, the known samples that you were provided for this particular record, all of them, their profiles, their DNA profiles, did not appear in any of the previously analyzed material that you had done in record 4.
That's correct.
Okay. And again, People's Exhibit 221, is that a report that you authored?
Yes, it is.
Is there anything different about the one that you submitted to the agency than that particular exhibit?
No.
Your Honor, I move for the submission of People's 221.
No objection.
Received.
Actually, I had this right in my notes, and I thought I had it wrong, but we're kind of working backwards here. Record 8. Pull that up here. All right. Record 8 is what, Ms. Meredith?
Record 8 is a report authored by myself that references the preparation of Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, and Robert Kanar's reference samples. So I discussed earlier that two-step process of body fluid identification or serology first, followed by DNA. This is just the preparation of those samples for DNA analysis. So a swab came in of those individuals, and it was cut and prepared for DNA analysis. So this report just reflects that those samples were, a portion was removed from them for DNA testing.
I apologize. We should have went through this report first and the DNA report second, but essentially this is the setup for Record 7.
Correct.
Okay. And again, Ms. Meredith, is there anything in that report that is labeled as an exhibit that is different than the one that you provided to the investigators?
No.
Your Honor, I would move for the admission of People's 222.
Received.
Thank you. I have no further questions of this witness.
Ms. Meredith, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Fred Johnson. I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Mr. Wilson, could you put 221 back up for me, please? Sure. And while he's doing that, Ms. Meredith, Mr. Wilson, in his direct, asked you a few questions about how you clean your lab and whatnot. And I think one of the questions that I didn't get a clear answer to was whether or not you folks use bleach to clean, sterilize, remove the evidence, that sort of thing. Do you use bleach in that process in your lab?
We do use bleach as a sanitation method.
As far as you know, have you ever used Tide laundry detergent as a sanitation method in your lab?
No, not to my knowledge.
All right. Are there other household products? Are there other products that you use or that are used? I'm not saying you would clean your lab. Are there other products that are used to clean your lab that are available, say, for the public might go out and purchase at a pharmacy or a supermarket?
Yes, many cleaning products would destroy DNA.
For instance,
Uh,
pine salt,
Possibly.
okay, alcohol.
Possibly.
Anything else? Anything else that you use in the lab that we can buy at the market or the pharmacy?
We use a sanitation wipe. It's like a large cloth wipe that we'll use to clean bench tops with. That is a sanitation product.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Ma'am, during the course of this trial, we've heard that my client's grandfather's home was searched by the police, and you probably know it better as 3038 Bailey Street. Are you familiar with that address?
I am.
And in fact, you had your record number one, it hasn't been admitted, but record number one, you talk about your participation in that particular process.
I would have to reference that record number.
And, well, there's only part of it that I want to talk to you about. May I approach you on it?
You may.
Well, you know what? Let me show Mr. Hilson what we're talking about, and then I'll show you. All right, now, and I'm going to point you to the part that I'm talking about because I don't expect you, I imagine you've written a couple reports in your time as a police officer, and I don't expect you to remember verbatim.
Analyst would analyze for the presence of samples suitable for DNA and work with the agency to determine which samples are going forward for DNA testing to gain the most information possible. So I didn't have any decision making in which samples went for DNA testing in this particular scenario here. And I received the tubes and I processed the tubes for DNA analysis. That decision making process was an analyst that did the work prior to me.
Okay. And who was that analyst you recall? Do you know?
I believe that Michelle Schmidt is the analyst who did that prior work.
And is there a reason why Ms. Schmidt didn't go ahead and do this work, or is that just not her job description and yours?
It varies from case to case. Sometimes we will do several weeks worth of work or months worth of work doing serology and then do DNA analysis. We're both trained and proficient in both areas. And at that particular time, I was doing DNA analysis and she was doing the body fluid identification. So the case would have been processed by her, packaged, and then when I got ready to do DNA testing, I would have removed those samples and done the DNA work on them.
You talked initially with Mr. Gilson and a little bit with me about how it's necessary to keep your lab sterile and prevent cross-contamination, like one sample contaminating another, that sort of thing?
Correct.
And why is that? Why is it important that the sample you have from Ms. Bletch not be contaminated with any information that you may have from Joe Doe?
To protect the integrity of that evidence sample and to aid in the interpretation of it. If we're cross-contaminating samples, then we are interpreting that additional data in this sample. So it's to protect the integrity of the evidence.
Okay. And if you know, do you know if police evidence labs or police evidence lockers, police evidence rooms follow the same standards of cleanliness and security of materials and cleanliness that your labs do? You know?
We work with hundreds of agencies across the state. I can't speak to what each individual agency does as far as their own policies and procedures.
Would it be true then to say, if you know, that there's some variance that depending on the agency and the location and a lot of different information, that there might be variance in between how each lab or each evidence locker is maintained?
That would probably be a fair statement.
Okay, thank you. One of the folks that you tested against was when you given DNA from people. What is that called?
A reference sample.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
One of the people you referenced samples with was Brian Harris, who was a police officer. Do you know why you were giving Brian Harris the sample?
I myself didn't have any involvement with Brian Harris's sample, so that would be better spoken to by the analyst that did that work.
Okay. You mentioned that there on the sunglasses for Miss Bletch, there was you found DNA of an unknown male.
Correct.
Okay. That's the end of my notes. Let me see if they've got a couple other questions. That unknown male, did the identity of that person ever become available to you? I know it wasn't at the time you tested, but did the unknown male with sunglasses, did you ever get who that person was? Did you ever find out?
I believe that was identified, but I did not author that report or make those interpretations.
Okay. Might there be DNA in perspiration, a person's perspiration?
Sure.
One of the things, have you ever gone out in the field and actually collected this material yourself and then have someone else analyze it?
I have.
Okay. I'm curious, how does it determine which part of an object is to be tested? In other words, suppose I have a bath towel. Do you test the entire towel or for DNA, or do you test a portion of it and assume this and hope that you come to results that you're looking for?
That's really dependent on the type of evidence and the type of incident, what we might be looking for, whether it be blood or semen or seminal fluid. We have various tools and chemical reagents available to us in that body fluid screening part of the process to identify if there are stains present that could be done, sampled for DNA testing. It could be screening for blood. It could be using an alternate light source to look for body fluids. But it's really dependent on the actual evidence item and how it's related to the crime.
So it is possible that you'll check one portion of an object, but not check the entire thing.
It's possible.
Okay. And I think you mentioned in your answer, part of your determination is depending on what's visible and obviously a blood stain, correct?
A blood stain's not always visible.
White towel, blood stain. You're going to see a blood stain. I mean, assuming on this example, you have a white towel, you have a red blood stain on it. That's something that you're going to check that.
If it's a visible blood stain, we may check it.
Okay, but you're relying on what's visible and what your tools can demonstrate. In other words, I understand you have, would you say, ultraviolet that you pass over objects to show if there's been fluids and whatnot on the object?
We have a light source available to us that has a broad spectrum of different wavelengths of light, which is just a scientific way of saying that different body fluids will fluoresce under that light, and we can use that to help identify where there might be a stain to then do additional testing to determine, is this saliva, is this seminal fluid, could it be a very diluted blood stain? We use that as just a tool to help screen evidence.
Okay. And in other words, there's some, you use your tools, you use what God's given you, the ability to see, hear, smell, touch, use all those things, and you use your training and expertise to determine which portions of an object you're going to test. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But even adding all that, obviously there's some human discretion about there. Obviously, if in applying all those objects, you say, I'm not going to, you may decide not to test a certain portion of an object. Is that correct?
That's fair.
Okay. Thank you. One moment. got a couple of lab reports here, and one of them wasn't even authored by one was authored by Ms. Schmidt. So I'm going to ask you if you can explain something for us. If you cannot, I get it. Okay. If you look at those two documents there, in one document it lists that there are 2 swabs that were done. You see where I'm pointing?
Are you referencing item 3
Item 3 and item 4.
and item 4?
Yes, ma'am. But when you evaluate them, there's only the one result. Do you see what I'm saying? Do I have that correct, or am I missing something? Or can you not tell because you didn't do both documents?
Without having her notes in front of me to know if a sample was combined or how she prepared it, I would not be able to accurately testify to this.
Okay. Tell me about combination of samples. What does that mean?
Sometimes we get evidentiary samples that are taken from common sources, and we may combine them to one sample for DNA.
When you say common, does that mean the same source? In other words, my wrist, and then you have 2 samples in my wrist?
An agency might collect a swab from a wrist and a second swab from another wrist, for example. Those 2 swabs may be cut and combined as one sample. But without her notes, I wouldn't know how that was processed.
And I don't want to put you on the spot there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Just one follow-up. I want you to put your serology hat on for just a second. When an agency submits evidence, do they pile it all in a box, unpackaged and unsterile, and hand it to you and say, okay, here you go, lab, figure it out?
No. We have very strict submission policies for evidence. Evidence is packaged separately. It is sealed when we receive it. We have that unique identifier is given to it as soon as it comes in the door and identified with that number. So to protect the integrity of that evidence as we process it. It's processed at different times, and we don't combine multiple pieces of evidence while we're processing. So yes, those evidentiary items are separately processed and separately submitted to us as an item.
So as an example, I'm just going to hold, we've had a lot of exhibits marked in this case, packaged in manila envelopes and packaged in brown bags separately. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct.
I mean, it's coming to you from the agency packaged like this.
That is correct.
And just for the jury's purposes, looking at what's marked as 150 and 151, and whether or not you looked at this, I just want you to reference to them the lab stickers and numbers that you're talking about.
So the evidence would come packaged by the investigating agency. It is required that that evidence be sealed and properly packaged when we receive it in. So you can see there's red evidence tape with signatures on this piece of evidence, the same on this piece of evidence. When Ms. Schmidt appears to have her initials on this, for example, when she processes it, we make every attempt to keep the same packaging and reseal it. You see that we have MSP Lab where she would have resealed it with her tape, including those unique identifiers. So here's that GR14-3508. That's associating this piece of evidence uniquely to that particular incident number. Item 1 would be that identifier as which piece of evidence we're referring to.
So, in other words, part of lab policy is it has to be received by you in this condition for you to properly analyze it.
Correct.
I'm assuming if it isn't like that, you don't analyze it?
We wouldn't accept it at the door if it's not properly packaged.
Thank you. I have nothing else.
One very brief. Ms. Meredith, there were two systems of software involved here, correct? The PowerPlex 16HS system and the PowerPlex Fusion system. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yep, I'm trained in both.
Okay. Do you know which ones were used for your testing?
For my testing, PowerPlex 16 was used. That's referencing which set of chemicals and reagents we used to develop the DNA profile.
Did you use the fusion method at all during your testing?
In this case, no, I did not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Judge. People of the state of Michigan call Sarah Rambank to the stand.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please have a seat. State your name for the record.
My name is Sarah Rambat, last name spelled R-A-M-B-A-D-T.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you tell the jury who you work for, please?
I work for the Michigan State Police at the Forensic Crime Laboratory in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And how long have you been so employed by the Michigan State Police?
Just about 5 years.
And all 5 of those, have you been assigned to the forensic laboratory?
Yes, I was originally at the Lansing Laboratory for about 2 years, and then subsequently at the Grand Rapids Laboratory for 3, all under the same position.
Now, let's talk about your education. How are you educated?
I have a bachelor's degree from Kalamazoo College, majoring in biology, and then I got my master's degree from Michigan State University with a degree in forensic science and a concentration in forensic biology.
Now, we just had testimony from Ms. Meredith about her training leading up to her being able to analyze stuff on her own. Could you describe for the jury what your training was, please?
Specifically for DNA analysis, my training consisted of about a year's worth of required readings, observing other analysts, conducting my own training samples, and getting the expected results on those samples, also oral and written exams, all before I was allowed to conduct casework on my own.
And did you also work with a supervisor prior to that as well? I mean, is that part of it, like an apprenticeship, if you want?
During that time period, I was under the supervision of a qualified analyst, and they would review any of the samples that I ran, make sure I got the expected results, or discussed any problems I had or any issues that would have been brought up during that testing. But yes, there was a qualified analyst that was in charge of my training.
And I suppose I will assume that you have passed all your certification tests.
Yes, all of the tests that were a part of my training I've successfully passed.
Now, during your 5 years, have you had the opportunity to testify in court before?
Yes, I have.
And how many times?
About 25.
And in those 25 times, were you qualified as an expert in your field?
Yes, in most of those testimonies.
And, okay. And I'm assuming, is that your testimony, you've testified across the state, or have you stayed on the western side?
Across the state, some cases in Detroit as well as some in the UP.
Okay. Your Honor, based on Ms. Rambat's testimony, I'm asking the court to qualify her as an expert in forensic biology that would include serology, DNA analysis, and the statistical significance of DNA results, profiles.
Bob, Ms. Rambat, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Fred Johnson. One of your responses struck me. You mentioned that you've testified in 25 cases.
That's correct.
Okay. And then Mr. Hilson asked you if you've been qualified as an expert. You said most of them. Were there some cases where they denied your qualifications, or that no one asked?
For a few of those cases, maybe 2 or 3, I was never asked to be qualified.
Okay. So, in those situations where you're asked to be qualified, you've always been qualified.
That's correct.
I have no further questions and no objection.
All right, this will be able to testify as a qualified expert in the areas outlined in the proffer. You may proceed, Mr. Hilton.
Thank you. I'm going to start with People's Exhibit 223. First, Ms. Rambat, you were one of the analysts assigned to assist in the lab work associated with Grand Rapids Lab 14-3508. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to show you what I believe is your record number 11, People's Exhibit 223. And the jury has got it up, on their screen. What are we looking at in this particular record? First of all, the evidence portion. Describe what you had in front of you.
So for this record, there were several evidentiary items that were previously examined, including the swab from sunglasses, swab from phone holder, left wrist swabs, the swab from right fingernail clippings and clippers, swab from left fingernail clippings and clippers, as well as the right wrist swabs. Those were all previously analyzed in a previous record. The two new DNA samples that I would have analyzed myself with this record were a swab from the top back of pants and then a buccal swab from Roger Johnson.
Okay. Now, in what process did you use in analyzing both the, what process did you use?
The standard DNA process that we use starts by extracting the DNA from the sample material. We quantify how much DNA is present in that sample and then make copies of specific target areas of interest in the DNA. And then I amplify or copy that DNA and analyze it on what's called a genetic analyzer and generate what's called a DNA profile. So that standard process is what I used for the evidentiary sample as well as for the known sample in this case.
All right. So let's start with the what results you're able to determine from the top of these pair of pants.
No DNA typing results were obtained from the swab from the top of the back of the pants. Therefore, I can't make any comparisons to that item.
All right. And then as it relates to Roger Johnson.
So a DNA profile was obtained from Roger Johnson, and then I made comparisons to those previously analyzed pieces of evidence, and he was excluded from each one of those. The swab from sunglasses, swab from phone holder, left wrist swabs, swab from right fingernail clippings and clippers, swab from left fingernail clippings and clippers, and the right wrist swabs.
So, in essence, Mr. Johnson's profile, DNA profile, was not found in any one of those previously analyzed items.
That's correct.
Okay. Is there anything different about the report that's marked as People's Exhibit 223 than what your original report was?
No, this is the original record.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's 223.
No objection.
Received.
I'm going to show you what's marked as marked as People's Exhibit 224. It's your record number 13. Give me 1 second while I pull it up through here. Okay. What are we looking at in this particular record?
Again, with this record, we're examining some of those previously analyzed items, but specifically processed as a part of this record is a known sample submitted from Brian Harris.
Now, Brian has testified in this case. He was a evidence tech at the time of this particular investigation. Now, I noticed, did you use two separate methods in this particular to process his DNA?
At the time of the submission of Brian Harris's known, we had actually switched kit chemistries that we were using. Basically, it's a different kit or mix of chemicals that we use to amplify or copy the samples. This is the equivalent of using a box of Betty Crocker cake mix versus a Pillsbury cake mix. We're looking at some of the same locations in the DNA, but this new kit, we're actually looking at additional locations. So we're still generating a DNA profile. The rest of the process was the same. We're just looking at additional locations in the DNA. So for Brian Harris's sample, I actually amplified that with this new kit chemistry called Fusion, and all of the rest of the samples so far in this case had been analyzed with the previous chemistry.
Okay. Now, what are we looking at here?
So again, a DNA profile was obtained for Brian Harris's known sample, and then I compared him to each of the previously analyzed evidence samples. Brian Harris matched the major donor from the swab of the sunglasses.
Now, my question to you is, in the laboratory or in this setting, first of all, is it unusual for laboratory analysts to ask for known samples from investigators or evidence techs that may have processed a crime scene?
It's not unusual to ask for those samples in situations where the evidence is collected at a crime scene, and we might see other people's DNA present besides those involved in the case. We do ask commonly for elimination samples from anyone who could have touched any of these pieces of evidence.
And is it uncommon for you to sometimes find investigators' DNA on evidence that may have been collected from a crime scene?
It's always possible. A crime scene is not a sterile environment, unlike in the actual laboratory where we have sterile benchtop and I'm wearing personal protective equipment, making sure my DNA does not get onto something. At a crime scene, it's not a controlled environment, so it's always possible that someone involved in an investigation that has collected evidence could leave behind DNA. In the current tests we use, they're much more sensitive than they were 20 years ago, and even a small amount of DNA that's left behind can sometimes be detected and analyzed and potentially matched to someone.
So is it safe to say certainly that Mr. Harris's DNA would have been introduced prior to you getting it at the lab?
That's correct. Once it's submitted at the laboratory, that's when the process starts to be controlled from our standpoint of things. We have multiple positive and negative controls that we run with each batch of cases that we work on, and his DNA was not detected in any of those other samples or controls, so we would presume that this would have happened before it arrived at our laboratory.
Fair enough. Is this a report that you authored?
Yes, it is.
And is there anything different in that report that you submitted to the investigators that is that exhibit any different than the report you submitted to the investigators?
No.
All right, move for the admission of People's 224.
It is not objected to, Your Honor.
Received.
Okay, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 225. This is record number 16 under that same lab number. Is that a report that you authored?
Yes, it is.
What are we looking at here?
The two new analyzed pieces of evidence in this record are a known sample from Donald Pepera and then a right shoulder swabs.
Okay. And the method that you used to analyze the profile on both of those new samples was what?
The kit we used for these two new samples was that fusion kit chemistry, that newer chemistry that it looks at additional DNA locations compared to the old kit.
All right. And let's go down to your conclusion. What were you able to determine?
A DNA profile was obtained from Donald Pepera, and then the DNA types from the right shoulder swabs are consistent with a mixture of at least two individuals, including Rebecca Bletch and at least one minor contributor. Rebecca Bletch matched the major donor, and all of the other individuals compared were excluded as the major. Those individuals include Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, Robert Canar, Roger Johnson, Brian Harris, and Donald Pepera. The minor donor to this item was insufficient for conclusive association purposes.
Now, I don't mean to stop you there, but I will. We had Ms. Meredith kind of talk about that. What does that tell you? In other words, that particular conclusion, what does that mean as far as the minor donor is concerned?
There's just not enough information from the minor contributor in this case to make any comparisons. It's like having just two pieces of a 100-piece puzzle. There's not enough information. I know that there's a second person present in the sample, but I can't say anything about them. So basically, there's someone else there, but I can't make any comparisons regardless of how many knowns are submitted. Nothing can be said about that minor donor.
That was going to be my next question. So it doesn't matter what profiles are submitted, there's just no possibility given this insufficient nature of it to make any comparisons.
That's correct.
All right. I'm sorry to interrupt. The last part of that was of your conclusion.
Donald Pepra was excluded as a possible donor to those previously analyzed evidence items: the swab from the sunglasses, swab from phone holder, left wrist swabs, the swab from the right and left fingernail clippings and clippers, and the right wrist swab.
And again, is there anything different on that marked exhibit of your report that you submitted to the agency that's missing? All right, I guess I'm sorry. The marked exhibit, is that an accurate reflection of the report you submitted to the investigators?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's Exhibit 225.
Okay. Receive.
I do not have any other questions for Ms. Mammoth.
Okay. Ms. Rambat, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Fred Johnson. I'd like to ask you a couple more questions. You are obviously in the lab now, correct?
That's correct.
Did you ever perform any other functions for law enforcement? In other words, were you ever were you a law enforcement official, a police officer, a road trooper, anything along those lines?
No, I'm a civilian.
Okay, and you weren't an investigator either for a detective or anything along those lines?
Nope,
Okay, and never were?
never.
Okay.
No.
And the reason, well, I'm curious now. As I look through your reports and I look through the reports of your predecessor here, I noticed a lot of evaluations done of nail clippings. And if you know, do you know why nail clippings would be offered for your evaluation in such numbers?
Nail clippings are sometimes collected at autopsy or during an investigation if it's believed or if it's possible that the person could have come in contact with another person. So if they would have grabbed or scratched, any of that type of action could deposit cells beneath the nails that could be collected and analyzed. So generally, that is why those are collected, because of the possibility of transfer of cells from an individual that came into contact with them.
Thank you. And an example, if someone's being assaulted and they reach up and scratch the person who assaulted them, that might leave the assaulter's DNA under their fingernails. Is that correct?
That's possible, yes.
Okay, and that's one of the reasons why you want to look at fingernails.
That's correct.
And you didn't find anyone but Ms. Bletch's DNA on her fingernails, is that correct?
That would have been a part of the previous report. I believe that one of the two clippings, I can't remember which one off the top of my head, was a mixture, but that the minor types were insufficient.
Okay. And is there a similar reason for why you're looking at wrists?
Again, in general, those may be collected if it's believed that a person was touched in that area. I don't know specifically for this case why those were believed to be a sample of interest. But again, it's the same theory that if those people were grabbed or pulled by the wrist, that we may be able to detect a foreign profile from that area.
All right. And the fusion system was used in these your work, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not the most proficient person with this stuff, but I have a... All right. May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
All right. Now I'm going to show you a couple of documents, and I was hoping you could explain them to me, because I got two documents here, and one of the documents indicates to me in my reading that that individuals can't be excluded based on their minor profiles. But the second document seems to say that's exactly what we've done. Am I misreading that, or am I not understanding that correctly?
I don't initially recognize this first document that you as my own, and I don't see a signature on it. I can see that it follows our general report guidelines. The particular statement you've highlighted indicates that the swab from the phone holder was not compared because updated lab policy does not allow for comparisons of complex mixtures for exclusionary purposes. And it looks like the date of this report indicates July of 2016. The writing of my report that includes some of the information from that phone holder, all of my reports precede this dated report.
So that was the rule at the time you did your reports?
If I'm reading this correctly, yes. I think in moving to the fusion kit, which is again looking at more locations in the DNA and is the chemistry as well as the instrument we use is more sensitive than the one that we used previously to originally obtain the profile from the swab from the phone holder. The community, the DNA analysis community in general, started to make changes in what was interpretable and what was not, and we did make a change in our laboratory policy. It sounds like in the realm of July of 2016 to not make comparisons to complex mixtures like the swab from the phone holder. So again, this looks like it was dated after mine.
So, to sum it up for folks who are a little slower, your analysis was accurate and within policy in the time you did it, but they've changed the policy in 2016. Did I get that right?
That is correct. We updated that policy at that time once we started looking at additional mixtures and the community in general moved towards changing their policy, yes.
Had that policy, the 2016 policy, been in place in 2014 when you wrote your reports, how might that have impacted the outcomes, what you reported?
Judge, I'm going to check. That's irrelevant. Whether the policy in 16, you can't apply a policy in 16 to a policy in 14. That's irrelevant.
If it changes the conclusion as to what she's testified, then I think it is relevant. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you understand
I do.
Would you please answer?
So the particular item that we're talking about is the swabs from a phone holder. And again, that was a at least 3-person mixture. It did not contain a major or minor contributor. And in this particular sample, the original analysis concluded that it was available for exclusions only. And again, the updated policy says that we are no longer doing it for exclusion only. Basically what that means is that there's enough information to see if someone's DNA types could be present, but that we cannot provide a statistic to say if a person is in fact included or not. So again, the only thing that we said about this sample to begin with was either they're excluded or no conclusive determination could be made. So those were the two options for that sample in particular. The comparisons that I specifically made, so I had the knowns from Roger Johnson. Originally, I excluded him from that sample. With updated lab policy, we wouldn't have made any comparisons. For Brian Harris's known, no conclusive determination was able to be made when comparing him to the swab from the phone holder. And then the additional known from Donald Peppera, I was able to, when making comparisons, I did exclude him as well as Robert Metcalf, Kevin Bletch, Robert Knar, Roger Johnson, and Brian Harris. Not Brian Harris. Everyone else that was submitted, I did exclude as being a contributor to the swab of the phone holder. Again, with the updated lab policy, we would have made no comparisons to that sample at all.
Thank you. In your direct testimony, you mentioned that you came to the conclusion that Brian Harris had contributed some DNA to those sunglasses. Did I get that correct?
To the major donor to the sunglasses, that's correct.
Okay. Is that considered a contamination when an investigator gets their DNA on object of evidence?
Again, it's an uncontrolled environment. Anyone could leave DNA behind on an object before it's put into a package and submitted to the laboratory. So his DNA is present on that item in whatever word you want to call that.
Okay. And an uncontrolled environment means somewhere outside the lab, somewhere where the protocols to make sure cross-contamination doesn't occur are in place?
That's correct.
And so you can get you get what you get. And is that uncommon? Is that uncommon for you to get an object and find that one of the investigators have actually contributed DNA?
This is not the first time that has happened in my own casework. I wouldn't say that it happens commonly, but it's not impossible.
Okay. And this, well, and tell me if you can answer this question. If you can't answer, that's fine. it is, you mentioned that DNA, what it is, and that we may or may not leave DNA when we touch something, or when our blood hits something, or bodily fluids hit something, we may or may not leave DNA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when DNA lands on an object, is it then permanent? In other words, is it then immovable, or might it flake off, or blow off, or rub off onto another object if the contact is made?
The DNA or cells that contain the DNA that are left behind an object can very possibly be transferred to other objects that come into contact with them. It depends on there are many variables that it depends on, but including the type of surface that it's left on. So a body fluid might adhere better to a porous object like a piece of clothing rather than a hard surface like a gun or a tabletop. The cells from that type of item might be more easily transferred. And again, it depends on the conditions of the environment, the weather conditions, if it's left outside, that DNA or those cells might be washed away. All of that can affect whether or not cells are transferred from one object to another.
Okay, under the exact right circumstances, could DNA be blown from? In other words, can it be blown from one surface to another? If I have, say, an automobile, can I, and the wind blows, can it then blow that DNA off that automobile and onto another surface if under the right circumstances?
I guess it's possible. There's not a lot to say that DNA is an aerosol form, but dust is also primarily made up of human skin cells. So there's dust on lots of different surfaces. So I'm going to say it's possible.
Okay. At the microscopic level, is this stuff like a plastic or a goo, or is it hard and like I guess a piece of dirt or that can break and shatter and fly around?
So you're asking about the DNA,
Yeah,
the actual cell, like a cell?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is what is the nature of DNA at room temperature? Is it something that's going to be plastic and sticky, or is it going to be dry and like salt or pepper and then can blow around, or it can be, if you bump it together, it can flake away, that sort of thing? That's what I'm trying to get at.
So DNA is contained within the cells of whatever particular fluid or cellular material that you're talking about. So a blood stain, for example, is liquid originally, and then when it dries, it's a solid. So depending on the conditions in which a possible contact or transfer could be made, if the blood is wet, obviously if it comes into contact with something, it might transfer more readily. But these skin cells are going to be, as you can imagine, more, I guess, dry or flaky. It's not a liquid, it's a solid. And just like you imagine, dust particles can move around. That would be more of the transfer type, I would imagine, for skin cells that are left behind on objects.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Further, Mr. House?
Just a couple of follow-ups. So just so I understand, obviously fluids, liquid that dry is different than skin cells, essentially, in how they are left behind on a substance.
Again, it all depends on what type of cells we're talking about what type of body fluid we're talking about, and the conditions in the environment in which that transfer may or may not have occurred. There are many variables, and basically all I can ever say is it's possible.
Sure. But, when we're talking about body fluid, we're talking about sweat, perspiration, blood, obviously, saliva, correct?
Correct.
I think you had mentioned semen and seminal fluid, too.
Yeah, those are all the typical body fluids that we're talking about.
All right. And obviously skin cells. Skin cells are more apt to be, when we talk about the fingernail clippings, that's where you're going to find skin cells typically, right?
Right, that could be skin cells. Sometimes if the individual scratches hard enough, it could contain, some actual tissue or blood from that person that they've contacted. But for the most part, a lot of touched objects that we're swabbing, like guns and stuff like that, we're all talking about skin cells that are left behind on an object.
All right. Well, could it also be, perspiration, that kind of fluid. I mean, I wouldn't imagine people are spitting on things like guns and whatnot, but if you're grabbing a gun and you're sweating, why don't you leave DNA behind?
Through your sweat? Yes, that's possible.
And for example, if somebody is wearing gloves, and we're talking about there's some cross-examination questions about the swabs on the wrist and whatnot, and fingernail clippings. If somebody's wearing clothing covering their skin, does it make it more or less likely that you're going to find skin cells or be able to scratch somebody?
Well, if your body is covered with clothing or other material and someone's scratching you, obviously they're not going to get skin cells from your actual skin, but my clothing is going to have my skin cells, possibly the skin cells of other people who've come into contact with me or surfaces that I've sat on. So it's also possible that those skin cells could be transferred during contact as well, even though my skin was not exposed.
Similarly with gloves. If I'm wearing gloves and I go to grab you, am I going to leave any DNA behind?
Not necessarily. It depends on if those gloves are sterile, if you've touched other things that contain DNA before touching me. It's possible that you would not leave anything behind.
Thank you. I have nothing else.
In light of that, let's ask, okay. You get, if I'm wearing gloves and you scratch me and they take your fingernail clippings, you may not find my DNA, but will you, in your research, or will some researcher maybe find the fibers from a glove on your fingernails?
I don't know of any research looking for fibers under fingernails. That I think would fall more under a trace type of analysis, which I don't do, so I'm not sure.
So you don't do, so even if there were there, you're not looking for that, and if it's there, you're not going to note that and make a report. Hey, we found these leather fibers under these fingernails.
I believe that type of analysis or examination may be conducted at autopsy if there's obvious fibers or something present on someone's hands or fingernails. Again, what I believe was received into the lab were actually the fingernail clippings. So that wouldn't be something that we would do. We normally just swab those fingernails looking for just the cells. We're not necessarily looking for fibers. So I feel like that type of analysis may be done sooner than before it gets to the laboratory.
Thank you again, Mr. Watt.
I have nothing else, Judge.
All right, thank you. You may stand down. This is a good time for us to take, you may stand down, thank you, ma'am. This is a good time for us to take our break for the morning, so we'll take a 10-minute break at this time. You see the attorneys up here just a moment.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Please have a seat. State your name for the record.
Thank you. My name is David Hayhurst.
Mr. Hayhurst, who do you work for?
I'm employed by the Michigan Department of State Police, assigned to the Grand Rapids Forensic Laboratory in the Biology and DNA Unit.
And how long have you been employed with the state police?
I've been employed with State Police for over 12 and a half years now.
And how long have you been in the forensic biology?
I've been a member of that unit my entire time with the State Police. I also do a small amount of time with crime scene work, but my sole duties with the State Police have been through the Biology Unit.
Okay. And in order to become part of the biology unit, I assume you have to be educated in some fashion. Could you describe your education, please, to the jury?
Yes, I have a bachelor's degree in biology pre-medicine from Taylor University in Indiana. I also have some graduate school work. I have a Master of Science degree in biochemistry and molecular biology, and that's from the University of Illinois at Chicago. After hiring with the State Police, I continued my education specific to the tasks and duties that I'm assigned to. My training period at the State Police in biology and DNA was approximately 2 years, again becoming much more familiar with the specifics of the role of the job.
And could you also describe to the jury your training experience that gives you the ability to testify to that?
Yeah, so again, the upon hire, there's that initial training period. first in the serology or the biology screening portion of my duties. And that consisted of several months learning the policies and procedures that are in place, how we handle cases at the state police. And then when that was completed, I started my DNA analysis training. That took about a year and a half. Again, becoming familiar with all of the kits and chemistries, the procedures, the techniques that we use, as they specifically apply to forensics DNA instead of my wider background. After completing that training, we are required to attend some annual trainings or to maintain to stay abreast of the field of forensics. DNA analysis actually is a pretty quickly evolving field. Over the 12 years that I've been here, we've seen a number of changes. So training on new technologies as they're brought on board, staying on top of current developments in the field as large. I've attended a number of national DNA conferences, again, to see what's next, what's on the horizon in the field of forensics.
Okay. And have you testified in court before on your area of expertise?
Yes, I have. I've testified over 70 times in the areas of serology, or that initial biology screening, and or DNA analysis for different cases in Michigan, primarily in western Michigan, but a few across the state.
And were you qualified as an expert in both those fields when you testified?
Yes, I was.
Now, given that, Your Honor, I'd move for the admission of Mr. Hayhurst as an expert in the area of serology and DNA, the statistical analysis of the DNA profile, as well as the DNA analysis.
Well, here you go. Thank you. Take us. Hayhurst, good morning.
Actually, it's forensic scientist, but yeah, I'm a civilian.
Okay. Is it Mr. or?
That's correct, Mr.
All right. Mr. Hayhurst, good morning.
Good morning.
Fred Johnson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your
Certainly.
qualifications. You mentioned that you've testified in over 70 different court hearings?
That's correct. Hearings and/or trials.
Okay. Were those all criminal matters?
I believe they are, yes, all criminal matters.
And at those 70 different trials or hearings, were you always called by the prosecutor or were you called by the defense on occasions?
To my memory, it was always by the prosecutor. I do not recall any instances of the defense.
Have you ever testified here in Muskegon County?
Yes, I have. I've testified here approximately 5 times, 4 or 5 times in Muskegon County.
Okay, and you've been qualified as expert when you've done that?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. I don't have anything further, Your Honor. I have no objections to this witness's expertise.
You may testify as an expert in the field that was prompted.
Thank you, Judge. Okay, we've got a lot to go through with you, Mr. Hayhurst, so bear with me. I'm going to start with People's Exhibit 220. Okay, I'm going to hand this to you. 226. First and foremost, is that a report that you authored?
Yes, it is. People's Exhibit number 226 is a copy of a DNA report that I authored, and it is a complete copy.
Okay. Now, we've had a lot of conversation or a lot of testimony about a different laboratory number. This particular lab number was done in relation to which case?
So this report is under laboratory number GR13-2559, and this is record number 2 in that laboratory record. This was specifically some lab work that was conducted with respect to the Jessica Haringa matter.
All right. In particular, were you given a blood stain, or I guess a swab of a blood stain to analyze?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And I want to go down to your conclusions on that. First and foremost, can you describe to the jury how you developed a profile to use for Jessica Haringa?
Yeah, so in order to have anything to compare to our evidentiary sample, we needed a known sample. And in this case, because Jessica Haringa was not available to provide, typically we use buccal swab, which is a swab of the inside of the cheek. We can use blood cards too. She was not available for offering this sample, and so what was submitted instead was an alternate reference sample. We typically, for an alternate reference sample, we're looking for an object that has a lot of close, frequent contact with an individual and something that's not shared. So in this instance, a toothbrush was submitted that was identified as being from Jessica Haringa. That toothbrush, and the conclusion was there, did produce a single source female DNA profile. So there was, I got a complete profile on the technology at the time. that was identified or was from a female. And then in order to help support the validity of that as being a good reference sample for Jessica Herringa, I also had requested and received 2 additional samples, and they would be the samples from the biological mother and the biological father of Jessica Herringa. As I got complete profiles for each of those, I was able to compare the 3 profiles and do a paternity trio, and basically it's a confirmation that this child would be an offspring of these 2 individuals. And so the conclusion, excuse me, the conclusion says to support the validity of that as a reference sample, a paternity comparison was conducted. Comparison of the DNA profile from Jessica Herringa to the DNA profiles from Vern Jenkins and Shelley Herringa did reveal shared common alleles consistent with inheritance by full offspring. And anytime we give an association, we are required to give a statistic. And in this case, our paternity stats are a likelihood statistic. It is 7.247 million times more likely that Vern Jenkins is the father than a random individual in a Caucasian population. 1 in 775 million times more likely that he's the father than a randomly selected individual in the African American population, and 1 in 30.30 million times more likely that he's the father than a randomly selected individual in the Hispanic population. So again, the paternity trio looked to be a good trio, helps to support the validity. Yeah, this is a good reference sample that we can use for comparisons from Jessica Herringa.
All right, let's go down to your work then on the blood stain. And I think I've got it highlighted there. What were you able to come up with for the blood stain?
Yeah, so again, the blood stain was went through the DNA analysis process. It did give a single source profile. There was a female profile. And that profile matched this DNA profile from the alternate reference of Jessica Herringa. The 2 profiles were the same. Again, anytime we give an association like that, I will report a statistic. And so at the bottom of this page, this statistic's a little bit different in some of the phrasing. This would be worded, it's the idea of these 2 profiles match, and the probability of me going and finding another individual in the general population who would also, at random, who would also match that DNA profile would be this number, and that would be 145.5 quadrillion individuals in the Caucasian population, 1 in 8.410 sextillion in an African American population, and 1 in 1.291 quintillion in a Hispanic population. Excuse me. So it would appear that that profile is exceedingly rare.
And you kind of answered my next question, but certainly when you look at numbers in the quadrillions, the world's population is what now?
A little over 7 billion. And some of the comparisons are maybe not exactly quite there. I like to, this type of statistic, I like to liken to like the lottery. There's this huge number probability that I might win the lottery, but I'm probably not. It really seems to be stacked against me. But every once in a while, somebody does get lucky and beat those odds, and you do occasionally find that individual. So while it is exceedingly rare, and these numbers are higher than what the lottery would be at, there is that possibility that there would be another individual in the world who also has this DNA profile. It would just appear to be a somewhat rare occurrence.
Okay. And I think you indicated when you first picked up the report, there's nothing different in that exhibit than the original report.
No, there's not.
All right. Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's Exhibit 226.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right. Proceed.
Okay. Next is People's 227 and 229. Okay. First and foremost, I'm going to hand you, well, I'll hand you both. People's 227, just give me a second here, Mr. Hager. Okay. In 227, what is this a report of?
So People's Proposed Exhibit number 227 is another laboratory report that I authored. Excuse me. It does appear to be a complete copy. And in this, this is one of our serology type of reports. And in effect, it's a very procedural type report. This reflects that I received a known buccal swab from Kevin Bloom, the actual swab that was used to swab his mouth. I cut a small portion of that swab, placed it into a tube, and forwarded it for DNA analysis. So no types of testing, just very procedural, prepped it for DNA in effect.
And 229 then is?
People's proposed exhibit, number 229 is the actual original swab that was submitted. This is an envelope that contains within here. It is still sealed, and it bears my laboratory identification stickers, my initials, has the identification that was included in the report. This is the actual envelope, though, that contains the swab that was collected from Kevin Bloom. Again, I took a small cutting, prepped it for DNA, and then returned this to the agency.
Anything different in either the exhibit itself with the swab or your report?
No, they appear as I originally received them, with the exception of the property sticker here, or the court sticker, excuse me.
Evidence sticker.
Yes, thank you.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of Peoples 229 and 227.
No objection, Your Honor. Received.
And you, it's been marked as People's Exhibit 228. What is that?
People's Exhibit number 228 is a copy of a DNA report that I issued. It's the only DNA report that I issued under the laboratory number GR14-3508. And it is the DNA report where, in effect, I ran the buccal swab from Kevin Bloom, that DNA sample, and I obtained a DNA profile that was used for comparisons in a number of other records, but no comparisons were made to any evidentiary samples other than, at this time. The only thing was that I developed this DNA profile.
And is that anything different in this exhibit than your original report?
No, that appears to be a true and accurate copy.
Your Honor, I move for the admission of People's 228.
No objection, Your Honor. Received.
Okay. Handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 230. What is that, sir?
People's Exhibit number 230 is the initial report. It's laboratory number GR16-2492, and it is record number 1. This would be the first report that I issued under this laboratory number. And it actually is a DNA results, reports on DNA results from 2 pieces of evidence that originally started on this case.
I'm going to have those 2 pieces of evidence here for you in just a second.
Okay.
I was looking for the second one, Mr. Taylor, so I'll give you this. This is People's Exhibit 177, and could you describe what that is and whether or not that's referenced in People's 230?
So People's Exhibit number 177 is a container that was received in the laboratory that has, the second of the 2 pieces of evidence that's listed on the report. This actually has item 1B. It's one of the .22 caliber rounds that was recovered. It bears laboratory information stickers, and it actually has the initials of a coworker who did the actual physical swabbing of this item. All I received was the swab from the item. But this was one of those 2 pieces of evidence from the report itself.
All right. And you did just for reference, I think you indicated this was a unfired .22 caliber round. Is that correct?
If I can refer to my notes, I believe that's how it was described.
All right. Yes, you may. That helps refresh your recollection.
Thank you. Yes, it was identified as a .22 found that was round, .22 round that was found at the scene. It appeared to have been driven over, but the description is that it was a live .22 caliber round that was submitted.
All right. Got the second one here. This is People's Exhibit 172.
Yes, People's Exhibit 172 is the corresponding, the other piece of evidence from this laboratory report. It's that first .22 round that was recovered at the scene. It also bears laboratory information stickers. This one does appear to be open now, but at the time it was received, it would have been closed and would have been resealed and returned to the agency in that fashion.
And did you did you perform any DNA analysis on those 2 unfired rounds?
Yes, I did. I actually received swabs were taken of each of those rounds and submitted in separate containers. I performed the normal DNA analysis process, and my conclusions are listed at the bottom of page 1 of this report, record number 1. The first round, the item GR16-2492-1AX, actually gave a partial DNA profile, and it was a partial enough profile. There was not enough data that we were able to make any type of a comparison. It was just an incomplete enough profile that no comparisons can be made. The second round, the item 1BX, actually did give enough of a DNA result to indicate that it was a mixture of multiple contributors. So there was more than one individual's DNA on that round, and it was a mixture that was enough. So some of our mixtures we can look at and pick out a major or a minor profile. That would be a donor who is present in more or less quantity of DNA. For this one, because of the nature of the mixture, I elected to forward it to another analyst who was conducting some advanced computer modeling statistical analysis. And so my conclusion is it's a mixture. Look for some results in another report. Is basically the sum of it. That other analyst will use a computer tool to do some modeling and be able to make some more conclusions based on that computer modeling.
That other analyst, is that Michelle Schmidt?
That is correct.
Okay. She won't be with us until tomorrow morning, but thank you. So you're essentially those are the conclusions you made as the results of these unfired rounds.
That's correct.
All right. And again, is that report, is there anything different in the Mark report than your original report that you provided to the investigator?
No, there's not.
Your Honor, I move for the omission of People's 230. Okay. This is People's Exhibit 231, which is record number 4. Give me 1 second here, Mr. Taylor. Can you describe in general what you're doing, what this record is referencing, please?
Yeah. So People's proposed exhibit number 231 is a copy of my laboratory report. The laboratory number in the upper left is GR16-2492, and this is record number 4. This is a serology type of report. So this is the initial screening of a rather large pile of evidence that was received on this. Again, screening for potential stains, potential sources of DNA that might be present on these items in an attempt to prepare them and select samples to send for DNA analysis. So this is that first big screening of evidence that it was conducted.
Okay. And obviously, well, let's go through it one by one.
Sure.
First and foremost, I'm going down to your conclusion page.
Sure.
And if you could go through that one by one with the jury, please, and let them know what you were doing.
Okay. So each of the items is identified in the report with for an L number, with the exception of, I believe, one at the end. There's one at the end that's separate. But each of the items is identified with an L number, and these signify to me that these are items that were collected during a crime scene search that actually I was a part of. During that search, they were identified with L numbers, and they are carried throughout the report. The first number of items, the first L1 through L4, are swabs that were taken at the scene for items that we did not actually remove from the scene. Some of the items we were able to collect from the scene and take to the laboratory and process there. Other items I just swabbed while I was at the scene. So the first 4 items were items that I swabbed at the scene onto a cotton swab. And then this report, record number 4, is, again, kind of very procedurally saying that I cut that tip of the swab into a tube and prepared it for DNA analysis in case that was one of the items that was selected. Not all of the items on this list were actually forwarded for DNA analysis, but because I knew that some of them might want to be forwarded and others had to go to different units, a lot of these items were processed under the idea that I'm going to turn this evidence over to another unit in the laboratory, and it might not be as clean or as sterile of an environment as we like to work in. So I need to think at collecting samples ahead of time before they go to other units.
Can I stop you right there just to ask you some questions on that,
Yeah.
that point? For example, as part of this, item L5 was a black metal toolbox. You were at the scene of the search of the van, and I'm sure you remember what that looked like.
Yep.
Now, we had testimony from Sergeant Tom Flowers, who was, I believe, also present at
Correct.
the scene as well.
That's correct.
And he talked about some latent print work that he did to that toolbox.
That's correct.
In reference to what you just mentioned, when an item is going to be analyzed by multiple different units within the lab, is there a preference as to which unit gets what first?
Yeah, so on items that are going to travel through different units of our laboratory, we try to keep a pretty conscious eye to minimize the effects of contamination. The DNA kits that we're using today are so sensitive that we're a little hyper-paranoid and always very vigilant for watching out for cross-contamination and different types of contamination. So typically, items such as these, where they're going to travel through multiple units, will travel as this one did. They will start for that initial serology screening, DNA analysis type thing, type of analysis, and then they will travel, in this case, a lot of these items went to the latent print unit. Some of the surfaces of the items in this toolbox might have been good for prints or DNA, or maybe both, so that was kind of a conscious eye that we always keep in mind. And then after prints, they travel to firearms unit. Now, our prints analysts and our firearms analysts are very good at protecting against, and they know that they shouldn't be spitting on items and contaminating them if they can help it. However, just a part of handling these items in their normal course of duties, there is always that possibility. So we try to intentionally move the evidence around the laboratory in a very specific fashion. Again, it's one of the many steps that we take in order to minimize contamination from different analysts to the evidence, or from pieces of evidence to other pieces of evidence.
So, as an example, L5, the toolbox, did you receive that, or did you process that first before Sergeant Flowers did?
That's correct. We opened it at the crime scene so that we could inventory it. All of the items went back into that toolbox, and then it was brought back to the laboratory where I processed it and then transferred it to the latent print analyst, and then they would work on those items.
So the list now that we're going to go through, any items inside the black toolbox were processed by you first at the lab before they went anywhere else?
That's correct, because they were recovered with items L6 through L25 all within the toolbox. They were maintained in that fashion as they traveled throughout the laboratory. So I opened it, did the exams I needed, everything went back in, and that entire toolbox traveled to latent prints that then traveled through the laboratory, all together as one grouping.
All right. So I think you talked about the swabs. Well, let me ask you about the swabs you did L1 through L4. In particular, L1 and L2, the swab for the door, for the passenger side door.
Yeah.
Can you describe to the jury, I guess, why you choose certain areas to swab, and on those particular areas, why you choose the sub areas, I guess I'll call it.
Again, based on some investigative information that we had received while we were processing that van, it was noted that that door could be of interest to us. And so I swabbed both the passenger side, the door lock itself, I believe it was a manual door lock, and then the actual door handle. In the field, used a sterile cotton swab, sterile water, swabbed the surface of that. It's not in an attempt that I'm necessarily looking for a bodily fluid such as blood. This is more of the idea of a contact type of a swab. We're looking for someone who could have potentially left skin cells behind on that object. Again, those were two surfaces within the van that we had some information might be relevant. So those were both swabbed at the scene and then prepared for DNA analysis in this report.
Now, just your answer brings to mind for me another question. This particular van, when it was processed or when it was secured, was it secured outside, inside? Can you describe how that was secured?
When we arrived, it was being stored in a garage facility. I believe it was a county-type facility, but it was stored inside. It was roped off, taped off, and upon our arrival, it was closed. There was no one getting access to it prior to our arrival, so it was secured when we arrived. And then that's one of the items that I actually swabbed early on as we were processing, so that even ourselves as crime scene technicians would not contaminate, in handling different parts of that van. Those were samples that were taken early so that I could preserve the integrity of each of those samples.
And when we say garage, it's enclosed, not exposed to the elements?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, and you may have already answered it this way, but now as we get into the individual pieces, can you describe for the jury the different examinations you're doing, whether it be visual or whatnot, as we go through each one of these?
Yeah, so in that initial screening portion, there's several goals. The first goal is to identify samples that would potentially give good DNA analysis. When I'm looking for things such as bodily fluid, there are a certain number of tests that I have available to me that I can test for blood or for seminal fluid, and some of those will become relevant. Other items in this listing, maybe they were screened for the presence of potential bodily fluids, but only contact type samples were taken of these items. So it depends on a case by case or a item by item basis. Primarily, most of the testing though was with the idea of a blood stains. We're looking for blood stains. So we have bright lights in the laboratory. I have a big bright light that I will use to examine an item and see if there are discolorations. A reddish brown discoloration would be a good indicator for possible blood. Initially, there are two tests that I have for that are chemical tests for blood. They're both very similar in that they have a color change. If blood is present, one of the chemical substances within the blood will oxidize and it will cause a color change. So that would be a good indication of the possibility of blood. So one of those is called a hemostix, and that will appear throughout here, and the other one's called a phenolphthalein test. They both have a positive or negative result. There's also a follow-up test that I can do that is much more specific for human blood. It's a little less sensitive, so we don't like to lead with it, but it's more specific for human blood with very few cross reactions, such as ferret and chimpanzee, upper primates, some stuff like that. But it's a much better indicator of human blood. So those are primarily the tools that I will use in order to screen for blood stains on items. Again, these items would have been screened visually, followed up with the testing as appropriate, and then some items might have just been swabbed for the presence of contact DNA and forwarded, or we might have multiple swabs from a single item, depending on the nature of that item.
Okay. So as we make our way through on the metal toolbox, L5, were you able to find it?
Visual examination did not reveal any areas of interest. No stains were visible for potential testing. I did swab the metal toolbox. Again, a contact type swab. Again, knowing that I'm going to pass that along to a different unit, I wanted to take all of those swabs ahead of time, but it was not run for DNA analysis this time.
Okay, item L6, the two black Reebok gloves.
So item L6 is an apparent pair of black Reebok gloves. They would be like a baseball batter style gloves, a little more contoured. They were both black, and so a lot of times it's hard to see, hard to visualize those red-brown stains on there. However, on the gloves, there were 3 areas that did have some discoloration that I noted. Because of the nature of them, I chose to start with this phenolphthalein test, and it did indicate the possible presence of blood on the exterior of those gloves. However, when I followed it up with the hemotrace test, which is specific for human blood, that actually was negative, so it did not indicate the presence of human blood. So the first pass through, the first time I had this toolbox, all I did then was to swab the inside of the glove. Again, that's the idea of that contact DNA from whoever may have been wearing those gloves. That possible stain on the outside was not swabbed initially.
Now, so when you say the inside, are you talking, I mean, not the, I know it sounds self-explanatory, but just so we're not talking about the outside of the palm, you're talking about inside the palm.
Yeah, and on items such as this, I'm looking again to capture as many skin cells from whoever might have been wearing that. Typically, we find that this inner palm area is the best surface for leaving skin cells behind. So I swabbed the interior of those gloves the surface that would have come in contact with the palm of whoever were to wear those gloves.
All right. The padlock?
Padlock had a visual examination, did not indicate any or did not show any apparent staining.
Item L8, the mouth ball gag.
Yeah, item L8 was a mouth ball gag, had a red ball with some leather straps. Visually, I did not note the presence of any stains that were present on this item. However, I did take some swabs of this item before I turned it over to the other units. I swabbed first the actual ball itself that would go into the mouth, and then later I swabbed the leather straps that would have contact with the outside of the face.
Item L9, the batteries.
Item L9 were 5 AA batteries. There was some small staining that was present, but it did not indicate the presence of blood.
Item L10, the purple dildo / vibrator.
Item L10 was a purple dildo vibrator. It was a large unit. It was purple at the top, had some, I believe it was blue at the bottom. Visually, did not locate any red-brown staining that was on this item, so no testing was done for blood. I did swab the upper surface of this item, the end surface. There was the potential that other surfaces on this item might be eligible for print analysis, so I didn't just swab all of it. I wanted to preserve some of those latent prints intact, so I just swabbed the tip of that. Additionally, there was a human hair that was wrapped around or was on that item, but under examination it was not suitable for DNA analysis. There was no root of the hair that was intact that we need for DNA, for our typical DNA analysis.
Item L11, the silver vibrator.
Item L11 is a silver vibrator. It's a smaller, almost like a chrome silver type surface with a long cord, and then there's a controller attached. A visual examination showed one possible stain. It was negative for the presence of blood. The hemostix test was negative, so the stain was not sent. However, I did swab the tip surface of that vibrator in order to forward for DNA analysis.
Item L12, the white rope.
Item L12 was a length of white rope, a relatively standard small rope. There were a few areas of discoloration. However, phenolphthalein was negative. The chemical testing did not indicate the presence of blood.
And did you do any swabbing or taking of any samples for DNA analysis on the rope?
No, I did not.
Item L13, the length of chain.
Item L13 was the first of a couple lengths of chain. This was just strictly a length of chain. There were a few areas of discoloration. They were tested with phenolphthalein and they were negative. They did not indicate the presence of blood on that item, and so no samples were forwarded from that item.
Okay. Item L14, which was a length of chain with attached handcuffs.
So item L14 was in another length of chain. On the last link of this chain was a pair of handcuffs. One side of the handcuffs was actually cuffed through the chain itself, so it was attached to the chain. There were some areas of discoloration. However, using phenolphthalein, they all tested negative, which did not indicate the presence of blood. However, I did, again, because this item was going to travel to our latent print unit, I did take a swab of the interior surface of the cuffs. Again, that would be the portion of the cuffs you would expect to come in contact with the skin of whoever they might have been attached to. So I did swab that portion and send that for DNA analysis.
Okay. L15 was 2 small keys attached to a magnet.
Yes, item L15, there were 2 small keys likely to be the possibly to be the handcuff keys. They were actually attached to a magnet that then was attached to the upper inside lid of that toolbox itself. Visual examination did not indicate that or did not show any staining present, so no blood stains were tested for.
L16, the J-shaped hook with a ball on it.
So item L16 was a large hook. It was 9.5, 10 inches long and 3 or 4 inches wide. It was a large hook that had a rounded ball about an inch in width on the end of it, and then the other end had a ring so that it could be attached to something. Examined that with bright light, did locate a few stains of interest or a few areas of discoloration. They were tested and they were phenolphthalein negative, so the chemical test did not indicate the presence of blood on that item. Excuse me. However, I did take a swab knowing that it was going to go to a different unit. I did take a swab of that item. I believe they swabbed the ball on the end of that hook to see if we could get DNA from somebody who would have come in contact with it.
Okay. Item L17, black Mizuno right glove.
Item L17 was a black Mizuno right glove. Again, very similar in appearance to the batting gloves from earlier. Only this was a single. It was a right-hand glove. Again, it was black. Bright light did visualize some discoloration, but under testing it was phenolphthalein negative, so it did not indicate the presence of blood. Again, because this was going to travel to other units, even though there wasn't a stain present for swabbing, I did swab the interior portion of that glove, again, specifically focusing on that palm area that would come in contact with whoever was wearing it.
Item L18, the leather handcuff restraints with the connecting metal rod.
Yeah, so item L18 was, they were leather restraints that, a wide section of leather that then had a small lock that would connect it to a chain, and then on that chain there was a metal rod to hold it in place so the cuffs would hold approximately that far apart. Examined them with bright lights. Did indicate a couple areas of discoloration. However, when they were tested with chemical testing, the phenolphthalein test was negative, so it did not indicate the presence of any blood on that item. I did swab the interior portion of the restraint, again, in an attempt to get DNA from anyone who might have been wearing them, had skin contact with the two leather restraint portions, and that was prepared for DNA analysis.
Item L19, the lubricating jelly.
Item L19 was a 4-ounce tube of lubricating jelly. Had a small area of discoloration. It was tested using a chemical test. It was phenolphthalein negative, so it did not indicate the presence of blood, and no additional samples were taken of this for DNA analysis.
Item L20, the two Polaroid photos.
Item L20, there were two separate Polaroid photos. Examined them with bright light, and visually they did not have any areas of discoloration, so no areas were tested for any types of test.
Item L21, the syringe in a plastic bag.
Item L21 was a syringe. It was contained within like a sandwich type baggie. This item was examined with bright light. No specific areas of staining were present. A swab was taken of the needle portion end of the syringe and prepared for DNA analysis.
Okay. Item L22, the orange pill bottle.
Item L22 was a small orange, pretty standard pill bottle. Examined it with bright light and visually did not have any areas of discoloration, so no samples were tested for blood or any other fluids.
L23, the printer paper with type name.
Yeah, L23 was a piece of, like a standard piece of printer paper, had some typing on it. There were some small areas of discoloration around the edges. They were tested using the chemical test. They were phenolphthalein negative, so they did not indicate the possible presence of blood, and no additional samples were taken for DNA analysis.
Item L24, paper with handwritten.
L24 was a separate piece of paper, this time handwritten notes on it. Visually examined it with bright light. No stains of note were located, so no testing was done.
And I think that covered, well, no, I'm sorry, L25.
Yeah, so L25 was a black lockbox that was located within there. L25 visually did not have any blood stains present on it, so bright light exam, no apparent blood stains were noted, so no additional testing was done on that. Within item L25 were two additional items. They're reflected on the port as 25A and 25B. 25A was a small baggie with two sets of blue nitrile gloves within. They were both, did not have any, visually did not have any stains located. And then L25B was a ammunition, a box of ammunition that was partially full with live rounds. And again, a visual examination with bright light did not reveal the presence of any stains on these, so no testing was done.
I think L26 is the last item that was within the toolbox itself.
Excuse me. Item L26 was actually the first item in the next container.
Sorry, yeah, you're right, the Century Safe. Okay,
Yep.
go ahead, sorry, Mr. Hayes.
Yep. So all of the items listed before were within that toolbox. I received them within the toolbox. I placed them back within the toolbox and moved them. The next item that was received, and all of these items were actually submitted together in a paper bag containing items L26 through L38.
Wait, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
before you go on, I just wanted to follow up with what you just said about the toolbox. When you take those swabs, you'd mentioned on a number of the items in the toolbox, you had swabbed areas to be tested for DNA later. Those swabs, maybe you could describe the process. When you swab something, how is it protected?
Yeah. So we use sterile cotton swabs. They're very similar to like a Q-tip. When it comes time for DNA analysis, though, we don't need the actual wood portion. All of the DNA that we've collected, whether it's a stain or a contact type sample, is within the cotton portion of that. So in the laboratory, I will take each of those swabs and I will actually slice the cotton head off of the swab and place that into a DNA tube. We use small DNA extraction tubes in the DNA unit, and so by preparing them as much as we can now, it's less prep work once we get up in the DNA lab. So by habit, I will cut each of those swabs into an individual tube that is labeled. I prefer to, some people will heat seal them, I prefer to put each of those tubes into a coin envelope that is also labeled, and then that coin envelope is sealed. So now the sample is in a tube that's closed, but also within an envelope that's sealed. And then I feel comfortable that I can put a number of pieces of evidence from this case all in the same larger outer envelope because each of them is already sealed individually in smaller ways within. We do still separate. I will have all of my evidentiary type samples in one large envelope and all of my known type samples in the other. But even that is redundant. There's enough, I believe there's enough steps in place to help minimize that chance of contamination from evidence to known. But it's just one of the procedural things that I will do in order to, again, minimize that contamination.
So those samples aren't going in the toolbox. Those are kept separate. As you said, they're double sealed.
That's correct.
Both in the tube and then heat, or I don't know if it's heat sealed or
Evidence tape.
evidence tape.
Yep.
Evidence tape sealed and then transferred for analysis.
Yeah. And specifically for this case, again, initially I took a lot of DNA samples from the items in that toolbox. I believe there were 19 specific items that I took originally. I did not run all of those items for DNA analysis the first time through. So some of them just remained and stayed within that sealed envelope. Some of them never actually got run for DNA analysis, and they got returned to the agency. If they were to open them up, you would find the cotton swab still in the tube. Other items were opened and processed accordingly.
Okay. Let's talk about what you found in that Century Safe lockbox.
Yeah, so the next group of items were all together. Item L26 were actually 4 syringes that were collected. Visually, no apparent bloodstains were noted. However, I did take swabs from those syringes and cut and prepared those swabs for DNA analysis, but no actual staining was noted on them.
All right. Item L27, the lockbox itself.
So L27 was the actual lockbox. The exterior of it had a small area of discoloration that was noted. However, it was hemostix negative, which is our chemical test. It did not indicate the presence of blood, and no additional samples were sent for DNA.
L28, I guess a handcuff key.
Yeah, again, L28 was another handcuff key. I did not examine this item for any types of staining, and it was not swabbed for DNA.
Item L29, the handcuffs themselves.
Yeah, item L29 was an additional pair of handcuffs. They were negative. There was a small area of discoloration. However, chemical testing did not indicate the presence of blood, so no additional samples were taken from that item.
Item L30, the blue pills in the blister pack.
Yes, blue pills in a blister pack. Examined them with bright light. They did not have any areas of discoloration for testing.
Item L31.
L31 was a small vial. It was labeled as Humalog insulin. Bright light examination did not reveal the presence of any possible blood stains on there, so no testing was done.
Item L32.
Item L32 was 2 unopened contact lenses. I believe they were marked right and left, or R and L for right and left. Visual examination did not reveal the presence of any staining, so no testing was done on that item.
And item L33.
L33, excuse me, was a single individual 22 cartridge that was marked with a C. Visually examined it with bright light and did not reveal the presence of any staining.
Okay. Item L34.
L34 was a magazine, gun magazine for a handgun, 22 caliber. It actually had 7 22 cartridges within that were contained within. That was examined for the with bright light for the possible presence of staining, and no staining was noted on that item.
Item L35.
L35 was an additional magazine, an additional 22 magazine that was collected from a firearm, which actually will come down lower. It was removed from the firearm. It actually had 10 22 cartridges contained within. Examined that with bright light for any possible staining, and no staining was noted.
Let's see. Item L36.
L36 were 2 small items that were contained within this kit. The first was a small orange cap of some fashion, and then the second was a black straw. I would say it's very similar to like a coffee stir type straw, that size and shape. Visual examination on both those items did not reveal the presence of any staining, so no testing was done.
Item L37.
L37 were 2 black Adidas gloves. Again, similar to the gloves from before, these were black, like a baseball batter style gloves. Used bright light. Visual examination did not reveal any stains of interest, and so no testing was done on those.
Okay. Item L38, which I believe is the actual pistol itself.
Yes, correct. Item L38 was a 22 caliber Walther. It was a model P22 handgun. The serial number was defaced. Typically, we'll put the serial number on our report. This was examined for the possible presence of any bloodstains. Again, there were several areas that did indicate the presence of blood. Our hemostix test was used here. They did indicate the possible presence of blood. They were very small areas of staining, so instead of, typically I like to follow it up with that hemotrace test because it's specific for human blood. In this instance, because the staining was so limited, I did not want to waste any sampling in the serology portion to identify it as being possibly human blood. Instead, that entire stain was swabbed and forwarded for DNA analysis. There are actually a couple areas. The first would be there was a stain on the muzzle end, on the exterior of the gun. There was a second sample that was taken once the slide was removed from the gun. There's a second area of staining that would be very close to the first, but it would be within that barrel. My gun terminology is not exact, but within that that barrel surface of the gun. And then I also, at the time that I received it, swabbed both the grip and the trigger of that gun, again in an attempt to determine who had a lot of contact with that, holding that firearm.
Okay, so just so I understand, you found staining on the muzzle,
That's correct. What I understand to be the end surface of the gun.
and then when you pulled the slide back, there was an additional stain on the barrel, the exposed barrel part.
That's correct. Once that slide is either pulled back or removed completely, there were some additional stains that were noted around the exterior surface of that barrel. Those were swabbed for DNA.
And then ultimately, you did the grip and the trigger, an area where somebody would normally hold on to it.
Yeah. Again, that's pretty standard on firearms. I actually think that swab might have gotten swabbed and then closed up, and that swab might have traveled back with the gun. But that swab was taken initially because, again, once I turn it over to our latent print or our firearms unit, I have no expectation that they're going to necessarily protect it for DNA. So that swab was taken initially before I gave the gun to them, but it was not forwarded initially at that time.
Item L39.
Yeah, L39 was a knife that was contained within a fabric sheath, a fabric metal or a fabric leather sheathing. It was Dakota branded. Bright light examination did reveal the presence of a few stains. The chemical test did not indicate the presence of blood. I did swab this item, both the handle and then the blade surface of the knife, but not out of a particular attempt to get a blood stain because the testing was negative. More just, again, for that contact type of who might have had contact with those surfaces.
Item L40.
L40 Excuse me, actually, if I could jump back real quick. L39 was the first item that was not contained within that box that we had that second box that we contained. Item L39 was the knife, and that was contained separate from the box. L40 was also contained separate from the box. This actually was a tissue box, like a tissue box that was located from the floor of the van that was collected. On the exterior surface of that tissue box was an area of discoloration that was red-brown, and so it was tested. The hemostix test was positive, and the hemotrace test was positive, so that would indicate the presence of human blood on that item.
Item L41.
L41 was a large, light blue bed sheet, flat style, not the fitted style, but a flat style bed sheet. It was examined. Several areas of discoloration were noted. However, chemical testing using hemostix did not indicate the presence of blood on that item.
Okay. Item L42A.
Excuse me. L42A was a large black and white blanket that was visually examined for the possible presence of blood, and there were a few areas that did have some discoloration. They tested negative using the hemostix, and so they did not indicate the possible presence of blood. There were a few areas also in this blanket that had some whitish discoloration. So this is the first instance where I actually utilized another set of testings that are available, and that would be testing for seminal type fluid. I have an acid phosphatase test, is a chemical test that is an indicator for the possible presence of seminal fluid. It again is a chemical test like a color change. If a color change occurs, then there is some indication that seminal fluid might be present, and I can follow it up with some additional testing. In this instance, the acid phosphatase test was negative, so those white stains did not indicate the possible presence of seminal fluid, so no samples were taken.
Item L42B.
L42B was a pink bed sheet, again a flat sheet, not a fitted sheet. Several areas of discoloration were noted. However, chemical testing did not indicate the possible presence of blood on this item.
And item L43.
Excuse me. Item L43 is a swab that I collected at the scene of the van when we processed the van. One of the tools that I utilized at the scene was luminol, which is a chemical test which will give some, in the dark, in the presence of blood, there will be some fluorescence, so there will be some light that emits from possible stains. So this test initially tested as having the possibility of being some blood. So I swabbed it at the scene and brought it back to the lab. When I tested it in the laboratory using phenolphthalein, though, that follow-up test was negative, so it did not indicate the possible presence of blood. I did cut that swab anyway and prepare it for DNA, but I do not believe we actually ran that sample for DNA. Now, so I guess maybe we did. So it was actually prepared for DNA, but not because there was a stain that was necessarily identified from that.
The other thing, and I apologize because I thought I caught all this, that you had a known buccal swab from MJN.
That's correct. So all of the preceding items of evidence were evidence that we collected at the scene and brought back to the laboratory. Separately, in talking with the investigators and asking for as many known type samples from individuals as we could get, I actually had one reference sample that was submitted and I processed initially and prepared it for DNA. Again, this would be a buccal swab from the interior cheek of MJN. Again, I took a small cutting of a portion of the end, put that into a tube, and that was forwarded for DNA analysis at this time.
And I'll apologize to the jury. I meant to, and I told Mr. Johnson this, that I tried to go through and scrub her name out, and I missed this one, so that's why I'm not showing you, so that the public doesn't know. But MJ, you had a buccal swab with MJ.
That is correct. And again, very procedural. Cut it, placed into a tube, forwarded it for DNA analysis.
All right. Is there anything else on that report?
No, that is complete.
Okay. Again, did that report an accurate reflection of the report you submitted to the testing agent or the investigative agency?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I move to admit People's Exhibit 231.
Okay.
Judge, this might be a good time because I still have quite a ways to go with that.
That's reasonable. Ladies and gentlemen, prosecutors indicated this might be an appropriate time to take a break. Since we're going to have further testimony from this gentleman, so we will take our noon hour break. I just want to remind you, you may not discuss the case with anyone, you may not have any discussion with anyone involved in the case or review any media accounts of these events. And I'd like, then let's let's resume at 1:30, if you please. Let's make that 1:15. Let's be back here at 1:15. Please report to the jury room, and we'll recommence.
Judge, I just want to put one thing on.
All the juries?
They don't speak.
Housekeeping. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. The court had inquired about a few exhibits, and
Yeah.
I was able to track them down, and I did present them and show them. But, and both of us, we don't have independent recollection whether I introduced them or not. But 149 is the Fletch 911 recording, and I'll just formally introduce that now. It's 149.